Okay, so here we are. I'm Councillor Graham Campbell, co-convener of SNP Socialists, and it's with my co-convener and friend Janis Wilson. How are you, Janis?
Hello, Happy New Year.
Yes, we are still allowed to say that, particularly if you're Orthodox or Rasta like me, because our Christmas was a bit later than yours, so our New Year is still fresh in the mind. Of course, it's soon Chinese New Year as well, so we can still say it. And it's now what's coming after that, so you can still say Happy New Year right up until March, really. So happy 2025, or at least we would say that, wouldn't we? But unfortunately, this week was
Yep.
not so happy because it began with the inauguration of a certain orange blowhard on Monday. Janice, your comments.
Um,
Nice ones, please.
I don't have any nice ones. He's a bully, he's a bigot, he's a misogynist, he is a fascist. And Elon Musk summed it up perfectly when he did his hand gesture, which was not a Roman salute, and it wasn't him sending his heart out to the crowd, it was him giving a Nazi salute because they're a bunch of Nazis who are now in charge of the free world, which is terrifying.
Yes, and there's been a lot of discussion about whether that was a Nazi salute or not. Well, it's not the Hitlerite Nazi salute, but it is definitely a Nazi salute because white
Yeah.
supremacists use exactly that from the heart with a fist to the outer outstretched palm. That's how they do the fascist salute these days. So that was
Yeah.
a
And
fascist salute.
one of the German newspapers, I think it was it Die Zeit or something, covered it, and they actually had it blacked out because they're not allowed to show Nazi salutes in Germany.
Yeah.
It's against the law. So they basically had the headline saying a Hitler salute is a Hitler salute is a Hitler salute. So
Mhm.
coming from the country that is probably best placed to decide whether or not it was a Hitler salute, um, yeah, they've basically said it was,
I've
and
also seen enough neo-Nazis on demos to see that that's
yeah,
exactly how they do the salute. So, you
yeah,
know, so yeah. So, but let's talk about the general thing. Obviously, we got extreme racists, and obviously Trump's first bits of program were the border, the border, the border, and
yeah.
removing citizenship from people who have actually been born in the United States. One of the fundamental principles which he's going to try and attack, and also alibiing 1,500, January 6 attackers, including the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, fascist leaders who did the killing. Basically, they killed people. People forget that they actually did kill 5 people during the
Yeah.
course of that riot and insurrection against democracy. So it's quite astonishing that he should have the cheek to do that, and that nutter with
Oh, the
the
horn, the
Bull
hat.
Horns guy. He was
Yeah.
completely unapologetic. All of them were completely unapologetic, with the exception of one person who I think refused the pardon on the grounds that
Okay.
the MAGA Grand, she actually did refuse the pardon because she said, "Well, no, I was guilty and I shouldn't have done it." And there was one decent person this week, which was that person who refused Trump's pardon. But otherwise, 1,500 people have basically been alibied, and that means that they're clear to do that again. And that's where we're at in America, that a degree of fascist violence is now being normalized within that body politic. So you can understand why lots of people are fearful in America right now.
I think two things kind of apart from Elon Musk, the bishop who stood up against Trump with that speech that she gave that sent the MAGA lot off their heads, and also their lack of biology, because they've said that you are the sex you were at conception, which now means that everyone in America is a woman, because at conception you're a woman until about 6 or 7 weeks in. So it's their lack of any basic form of intelligence, along with having that powerful position, that is just, I think that's the scariest thing of all, is how stupid they are.
Yeah. Stupidity, yes, but also lacking in basic science. And of course, if
Yeah,
you accept that experts aren't to be listened to, which is what basically
yeah,
the whole MAGA movement's about, then of course they're not going to do that in government. They're not going to listen to people who actually know what they're
yeah,
talking about, are they? They're going to prosecute people who know what they're
yeah.
talking about. People like Anthony Fauci, the person who probably saved millions of lives despite Trump being in power. So that's who they are. the anti-science thing continues. But I just want to say a bit about some of the people who were at the inauguration coming from Britain and the impact that it has. Obviously, Elon Musk has been interfering in British politics by
Yeah,
stoking up the child, rape gangs and all of that issue, and again intervening in Scottish politics. He even mentioned the Chris Donald murder from 25 years ago. Quite why he's taking such an interest in Glasgow's politics is of some interest, but people like Lawrence Fox were invited over there to the
yeah,
inauguration. Obviously, Reform and them have fallen out a little bit. Steve Bannon and them have fallen out a little bit. So there's divisions amongst the far right camp, but we shouldn't take comfort from that because there's still, Reform are up in the polls. They came third in a lot of the elections we've just had in Scotland.
yeah.
We cannot be complacent. So, what's your sort of thoughts on that?
On the rise of reform.
Yeah.
I think the main thought I've got is that it doesn't matter how much we are recovering in the polls, which we are, which is fantastic news. But when you see the predictions for the general election, and you can look at the figures, and even without being a mathematician, you can see that the Tories and Reform could easily have a coalition government. Um, which I mean, the Tories have already lurched so far to the right, but to now be on a par with Reform, it's terrifying. And I know people are fed up with Labour, they're fed up with Keir Starmer. He's been a huge disappointment. But I don't get why they're turning to Reform instead of trying to reform the Labour Party from within. Um, Maybe the Daily Mail, maybe the scapegoating has eventually, it's finally worked, and people are going to blame immigrants for absolutely everything. But the fact that Labour is so low down in the polls and Reform and the Tories are so high up is quite something, I think.
Well, this
Even
had
in
an
Scotland.
impact on me
Even in
locally,
Scotland.
Janice, because
Sorry.
this had an impact on me locally. We were just discussing this at one of my community councils in Springburn last night about the rise of reform and how to challenge the racism about migrants and so on. And there's a need basically to spend a lot of time having community conversations with people on a very small, way. In a sense, you also have to use simple language to,
Yeah.
not convoluting. One thing the left is bad about is using ideologicalized terms to describe something very basic and straightforward. And I think we need to have very human ways of actually making people understand. This is how would you feel if your granny or your mum or your father or your brother or sister were treated like this, and you make the point about how refugees and asylum and migrant workers are treated, and well, if you had your way and we stopped all migration, well, that one third of your doctors and nurses in your local surgery, you've complained about lack of places in your health service or lack of housing or whatever. Well, these problems weren't caused by migrants. Somebody has to have those personal conversations with every person that is susceptible to that message. And one of the groups of people that I think was noticeable was, the Trump election showed that social media being controlled by far rightists has had an impact. The algorithms they're using, which is why a lot of left-wing progressives people are leaving X and maybe considering doing the same with Facebook, because basically those algorithms are set to prioritize right-wing, far-right messages, and it's
Yeah.
having an impact on young men. It's noticeable in how much young men are, even here in Scotland, are repeating back Andrew Tate, and they think Elon Musk is, the tech bros are great guys. And they're repeating some of the nonsense. So we have to get better at challenging that, and some of that is a lot of interpersonal things. So I think it's not as simple as reform,
I think
being
no,
anti-racist.
absolutely, absolutely. But I think it's also worth pointing out to people that once, if Reform did get into power and immigration was at an all-time low, they would still need someone to hate. And it's like, that old saying, first they came for.
Yeah.
Um, Once the Daily Mail and the Daily Express stop scapegoating immigrants, they will still have to scapegoat someone because these organisations exist to hate. So, they're never going to scapegoat the rich. They're never going to scapegoat, people like them. So it'll be people that are voting for reform now, who they'll turn on. And it's crazy. It's
I
crazy.
saw a great meme the other day, which was first they came for the transgender people, and then I did something about it because I've read the rest of the damn
Yeah.
poem.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where we're at. People just have to stand up. Just a brief bit to say about the SNP's leadership role. Well, so just to finish on the reform thing, I think you're right about reform and conservative coming together. I've long said this, that if you look at Canada, I was in Canada during the mid 90s when this exact thing happened, when a far right party called Reform eventually completely destroyed the conservatives from the right, and
Yeah,
then took over the progressive conservatives and formed what's now the Canadian Conservative Party, and it's likely to come back. But they did reform the Conservative Party along reform lines, and this is what the process we're observing here in Britain. It is going to lead to reform and the Tories ultimately coming together on a more right-wing trip. So I think that's where it's going. I have to say I called that out a couple of years back, so I hate to be confirmed, but that's where I think it's going, and they are
yeah,
going to be increasingly
mhm,
indistinguishable.
yeah,
Um, but for the SNP being the leadership of the polls, I think we can. It's interesting that there's been a swing because there's been disappointment with Stammer for obvious reasons because they basically attacked the very people who've just voted for them in all sorts of ways, whether it's winter
yeah.
fuel and so on. What's your take though on why the SNP's now got this leadership, this lead in the polls?
I mean, I think, I mean, yeah, I think a lot of people voted Labour to get rid of the Tories, even in Scotland. And now Starmer has gone back on almost everything he promised during his election campaign. People are now, and the people will be looking at the polls as well. They'll be seeing the rise of reform, and especially in Scotland, which is tends to be more left wing than the rest of the UK. Maybe not Wales, um, and maybe they're seeing it as the only viable option because the SNP is now they're going to reintroduce the winter fuel allowance. They're going to scrap the two-child cap. They're going to do it insofar as they have the powers to do so. You know, they'll do it to the ability they can. Um, and people are seeing that, and they're seeing Labour completely abandon their core voters. But what I find more extraordinary is Starmer has done all that, and people are still defending him. And if you look at there was a poll that came out on Stats for Lefties, and Starmer is now way, 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 way down in the popularity of party leaders. And they were saying that this is the first time that they can remember a prime minister who's only been in power for 7 months doing so badly in the polls. And it's probably a lot to do with the fact that he's abandoned his voters and there's the rise of the right. But in Scotland, I think people are now beginning to realise that they do have a social democratic party they can vote for who will look after their interests. But again, we can't be complacent.
Well, would you say that the budget? I mean, obviously, Sweeney has been clever about challenging the other parties to vote
Yeah,
for his budget because it contains the things you mentioned. But also, the truth is that Rachel Reeves is all under pressure just now as the UK Chancellor has actually given the Scottish government a little bit more money than they had. So actually, Sweeney's room for manoeuvre is a bit bigger than it was. But like the austerity ahead in the years to come, if things continue as they are, that growth ain't coming. They seem to be abandoning the climate change commitments by expanding airports, and everybody knows that expanding airport doesn't do their job. But it seems that they're willing to reverse some of their fundamental things and maybe even split their own cabinet on it. It's possible. I mean, I've heard talk of Rachel Reeves not even surviving
yeah,
the next couple of months. So it seems weird for a government so new, so elected on a manifesto for change to be already so vulnerable. What's your take?
on why that's the case, or
Yeah.
just, I mean, because they promised change and they've delivered nothing. They've gone further than the Tories in terms of cuts and austerity, and people are desperate. People are struggling, really, really struggling. And they looked upon Labour as their way out of abject poverty. Labour could have taxed the rich, they could have closed tax evasion loopholes, they could have done so much more. They could have taxed the energy companies, um, and they haven't. They've just continued with Tory austerity. And the budget was just, yeah, they had so much opportunity to change the lives of people in the UK, and they chose not to.
Well, one
So
of the
that,
key things that drove support for independence in 2014 was the anti-austerity mood in the country amongst all sorts of layers of the population, brought on by things at the time, like the bedroom tax, the
mhm,
massive cuts to student work, situations, and austerity measures to councils, all of that built up ahead of steam for independence. And I think that the chances are that's having another impact now again, and may do in
Yeah,
the near future. But hey, that's another discussion. We can have lots of
that's
discussion about
yeah,
independence, so we will
yeah.
do that in future once. And move on to our final but probably most important subject, which is the Gaza not ceasefire.
Yeah.
Janice.
Who could have predicted that that Netanyahu wouldn't abide by the ceasefire? I mean, yeah, they're ramping up violence in the West Bank. Um, Trump was seen when he was signing one of these ridiculous executive orders. Oh, Gaza's on the coast, and yeah, they've got no intentions of giving Gaza back to the Gazans. They're going to obliterate it. I even heard somewhere they were talking about sending people from Gaza to Indonesia. Um, they're never going to stop. They're never going to give up. It doesn't matter how many ICC court rulings are against them and how many arrest warrants are out for them. It's never going to change, and it's just so desperate. The whole situation is desperate. Um, because
There is
Trump,
such a long, sorry, there was, but I'm
no, no,
saying
you're fine.
there's such a long process of, this move has got to be done by Hamas, this move has got to be done by Israel. And it's going over, like, I think it's like 48 or 60 days, something like that. It's a long process of exchanging of hostages on both sides. And I say the Palestinian prisoners are hostages, by the way.
Yeah, yeah.
They've got 10,000 citizens. Which country is ever allowed to kidnap the citizens of another country, imprison them without trial for months and years, including children, and get away with it?
Children,
They're
yeah.
hostages, and people should, it's annoying when watching the news coverage of how unequal that is. They rightly call the Israelis hostages, but call the Palestinians prisoners and terrorists. It's just outrageous. But
Did you read?
that's where we're at in the way this war is being covered.
Did you read Starmer's statement on the ceasefire? It
No.
was just, oh, it was awful. It was awful. He doesn't give a shit about the Palestinians. The Labour Party under Starmer is riddled with Islamophobia. Um, it was awful. It was just disgusting. Um,
And
yeah,
pro-Zionism, because obviously too many of them are very, very closely associated with, the groups in the Labour Party that lobby for Israel. So they are very too linked
yeah.
to continuing to militarily support Israel while it's carrying out a
Well,
genocide.
and he's also reviewing the weapons licenses that he withdrew. He's now looking to reintroduce them, and yeah, it's just the whole situation is desperate, and there's no one that can stop it.
Well, I
Um,
think of the other thing as well, the fact that they've been attacking Jenin, and they see Jenin as a
yeah,
center of resistance on the West Bank, and there's plenty of people in that Israeli cabinet that want to completely annex the West
yeah.
Bank. They have no intention of implementing the two-state solution,
But
and that's where
but
we're
you
at.
but let's not even pretend that Netanyahu gives a fuck about the hostages. Netanyahu couldn't care less about the hostages because if he did, he wouldn't have obliterated Gaza the way he has. That's the bottom line.
Well, so just leave on that sour note, but I don't have much hope for that, unfortunately. But we
No,
must stand by the Palestinian people still, and I know that people of Scotland do. So we'll keep
yeah,
on doing that. So let's end this talk with some hope for the future that we will see a Palestinian state in the very near
yes.
future.